Let's now consider what exactly Aquinas might say in response to the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, I should mention that Aquinas never actually responds to the Euthyphro dilemma. He never raises the dilemma and offers a response himself. And so what I'm about to describe is really just kind of taking the natural law theory as we see Aquinas develop it in question 94, and then what I'm going to try to do is come up with how Aquinas might in fact respond given his natural law theory, right? We're going to take what we find in question 94 and try to think through how it might offer a response to the Euthyphro dilemma, right? And so this is a bit speculative or conjectural, although I think just about everybody thinks something like this would likely be the Thomistic response to the Euthyphro dilemma. All right. So what is the Euthyphro dilemma? There it is for you. I include it there. The basic idea, as I discussed in an earlier video, if you think that God's commands are central or essential or important for morality, and that God in some way or another commands whatever it is morality commands, well, then you're faced with this problem, this thing called the Euthyphro dilemma. And the problem is something like this. Does God forbid morally wrong actions because they're morally wrong? Or are morally wrong actions morally wrong because God forbids them? Those would be options A and B. And the problem is that if you think God's commands are important for morality, you've got to go with either A or B. But whichever way you go is problematic, because if you go with option A, well, then you reduce God to a mere middleman. He's just passing along information to us and doesn't really have any essential role to play with regard to morality. But if you go with option B, well, then morality looks arbitrary. God could just come and change it. God looks something like a dictatorial tyrant, just issuing commands by fiat, and whatever he says, that's what we have to listen to now, even though there's no reason behind it, even though it's not for any particular good. Because if there were a reason behind it, if there was for some particular good, that would shift you back into option A. And so as we've been talking about the Euthyphro dilemma, I've been focusing on a specific example, right? God forbids murder because it's morally wrong, or is murder morally wrong because God forbids it, right? Those are your two options, option A and option B. Now, according to Aquinas, God does indeed forbid murder. That's part of the natural law. And so now the question is, well, what would Aquinas say about A and B? Which camp would he be in? Which road would he try to take? And depending upon which road he takes, how would he solve the problem? Or is he just faced with that problem, and that's a problem for his view? That's a reason to think that his view is incorrect, or it's less plausible than it might otherwise be, or something like that. Now, what I'm going to try to explain to you is why I think Aquinas would, in a sense, there are different ways of explaining how Thomas would likely respond to the Euthyphro dilemma, different ways of getting at the same point. The way that I'm going to explain it is by saying that Aquinas would, in some sense, accept both A and B, except he'd want to qualify it in certain ways. In ways that resolve the problems that A and B run into. Other ways of presenting Thomas's likely solution to the Euthyphro dilemma would be to say he'd accept neither A nor B, or something like that. But then, really, the philosophical substance is in understanding what he would say about each of A and B, how he would respond to it, what exactly he would say that's right about it, what exactly is wrong about it, how exactly he would modify things. So what really matters is understanding what he would say about each of these alternatives. So let's take the prohibition on murder, right? Aquinas thinks that's part of the natural law. That's something that God commands. It was written in our hearts by God. That's the natural law. You can figure it out. It's self-evident. Okay, fine, great, good, perfect, right? What would Aquinas say about alternative A? I think he would say, and this is the way I'm presenting it, he would say that A is right, in a sense, that there's some truth to A. That in a sense, sure, yeah, God forbids murder because it's morally wrong. Well, why would he say that? Recall the natural law. Recall what we looked at when we were considering these secondary precepts. The natural law commands us to do good and avoid evil. And then we figure out more specifically what the natural law commands by looking to our natural inclinations. We have natural inclinations for certain things. Those things which we have natural inclinations for, our reason apprehends as good. And the opposites of those things, our reason apprehends as evil. And so we can take our the things that we have natural inclinations for, we can plug them into the first precept, and we can derive secondary precepts, right? The natural inclinations, as I tried to explain when we were going over the secondary precepts, those flow from our human nature. When Aquinas talks about our natural inclinations, he's talking about our human nature. And so when he forbids murder through the natural law, he's forbidding it because it's contrary to our human nature. And there are any number of ways to see this. Look, for example, at the fourth natural inclination that Aquinas lists. We have a natural inclination for living in society, for being social, for living in communities. And so our reason apprehends that as good. Social behavior is good. Living in communities is good. Its opposite, asocial behavior, is evil. And there's hardly more asocial behavior than murdering people, right? And so it's going to be part of the natural law. Don't murder. And the reason God commands us, the reason God gives us this natural law, the reason he tells us to live in society, to be social, to avoid offending your neighbors, to avoid murdering your neighbors in the extreme case, is because doing those things, avoiding murder, being social, pursuing knowledge, raising your children, and so on, that's how we come to perfect our human nature. That's how we come to perform our function well. That's how we come to be happy. That's how we acquire beatitude, right? That's why God's forbidding, in this case, murder. He forbids murder because it's contrary to our human nature and so contrary to our happiness, to our beatitude. And in Aquinas' view, since God cares for us and wants us to achieve beatitude, right, that's why God's going to command us not to murder, something like that, because murdering is contrary to human nature. Well, that looks a lot like A. He forbids murder because it's wrong, because it's contrary to our human nature. Right? God sees that murdering, just keep using this example, is contrary to human nature and so informs us of that, right? Hey, I can see what your nature is like. Murdering is contrary to it because you are this kind of naturally social creature. So don't murder. That's going to be bad for you. That's going to detract from your happiness, from your beatitude, from your flourishing, from your living a good life, being a good human being, perfecting your human nature, right? And so God commands us not to do that. Well, is God a mere middleman then? Right? Is he kind of in essential, like, we don't really need God in the picture? Because after all, God's just kind of passing along information about our nature to us, right? At least on Aquinas' view, that seems like what's happening, right? The natural inclinations and do good and avoid evil, and you put those things together. Really, the source of kind of wrongness, The source of morality, rightness and wrongness, the source of morality is human nature. Our moral duties and obligations are derived from our human nature. And God's just kind of passing along this information to us. Look, murdering is contrary to human nature, so don't do it. And, pursuing knowledge, that's in accord with your nature, so do it. And, preserving your life in accord with your nature, do it, and so on, right? God's just kind of passing along information. Well, that's a problem. Why mention God at all in that case, right? Is God a mere middleman then, on Aquinas' view? Arguably, no. Well, why? I've just been making this case that he is. Well, because Aquinas would also think that B is true in a sense. One problem that B doesn't run into is that God being a mere middleman. God is not a mere middleman on alternative B. It's God's forbidding something that makes it wrong on alternative B. So far from being a mere middleman on alternative B, God is the source of morality on alternative B, it seems, or something like that. It's God's commands that are. God, in some sense, is. Well, I was just talking about human nature is the source of morality, because Aquinas says all this stuff about natural inclinations and so on. And so how could Aquinas think that B is true in a sense, if B seems to be committed to saying something like God is the source of morality? Well, the idea here is that God is the source of human nature. God is the author or creator of our human nature. And so, since human nature is the source of morality, right? Why human nature is the source of rightness or wrongness of certain actions? It's because certain actions either kind of violate or are in accord with our human nature that those actions are right and wrong. Right. And so human nature is the source of morality. Well, God is the source of human nature. And so God is kind of, in some sense, the ultimate source of morality, because God created human nature in the first place. And then once it's created, it becomes the kind of standard for our actions. Right. We ought to act in accord with our human nature and not in violation of it. Recall our discussion of the eternal law. Recall what Aquinas has to say about the eternal law. We find a very similar thing at work here. When we were talking about the eternal law, I used the example of a duck. And so we focused on the eternal law as it applies to ducks. And the idea was that God creates duck nature. He comes up with the idea of ducks in the first place. He comes up with the idea of an annoying bird that eats mud or whatever ducks do and lays eggs and squawks He comes up with that idea. He comes up with the standards for duck behavior in the first place, and then he goes and makes a bunch of ducks, and these ducks live up to those standards and so on and so forth. Same exact thing is happening in the case of human beings. God created human nature in the first place and then made human beings which embodied that human nature, right? And so the idea is, then the idea is that God is the source of our human nature, the creator of it, and so is ultimately the source of morality. Well, okay, so it looks like Aquinas is pretty comfortable then in alternative B, maybe, in as much as God is the ultimate source of morality now. Well, the problem there with alternative B was that morality was arbitrary. So does Aquinas actually face that problem? Arguably, no. Why? Because A is true in a sense, right? Because God can't just, and so the idea would be God can't just come down and tell us to go murder people with brown hair tomorrow. Why? Because that would conflict with our human nature. That's not the kind of creature we are. God didn't make us like that. He made us with a very particular nature, this human nature, which is social. And insofar as we have that kind of nature, There's only certain kinds of things that it's appropriate for us to do. And there are certain things that is going to be inappropriate for us to do. Murdering people is one of the things that it's inappropriate for us to do. And so long as we have the same human nature, God can't come down and tell us to go murder people with brown hair. And so morality is not, in fact, arbitrary. It's not just at God's arbitrary whim what we ought to do. No, it's determined by human nature, right? It's not arbitrary. It's determined by human nature. Well, then is God a mere middleman then? He's just telling us this stuff about human nature? No, because he's the author of human nature, right? And so this is the way in which I think someone like Aquinas is going to try to avoid the Euthyphro dilemma, right? He's going to say that in a sense, both A and B are correct. They're right in a sense. There's something true that they're latching onto, but the problems don't follow if you have a Thomistic account of natural law. And what I hope to have illustrated for you is the fact that Aristotelian views about happiness and human nature are essential to this response to the Euthyphro dilemma. Aquinas is able, if you think this all works, Aquinas is able to avoid the problems of both A and B by relying on human nature. And he gets this emphasis on human nature from Aristotle, right? We need to look at the characteristic and essential activities of a human being. And a good human being is one who engages in those activities well, and so on. All that straight out of Aristotle, and Aquinas has imported it into his account of the natural law. And so what we find in his account of the natural law is this attempt to synthesize Aristotelian ethics with its focus on human nature, or the human function, and virtue and happiness, or beatitude, as Aquinas calls it. So Aristotelian ethics on the one hand, with this law conception of ethics on the other hand, this law conception that Aquinas inherits from his kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? The Christian tradition that he is a proponent of. And so what we find is that law tradition and that Aristotelian tradition merging in this account of the natural law, and the precise way in which these two traditions merge, or that Aquinas tries to merge these two traditions. The precise way in which he tries to do that is illustrated, I think, most effectively by looking at the way Aquinas would try to resolve the Euthyphro dilemma.